Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Morgan, MVP, Product Innovation Architect, Modality Systems UK, who will be talking to you today about starting your Microsoft Teams platform development journey for developers and non-developers alike. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC20. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. Interested in taking part in ESPC 20 in Amsterdam this November? Call for speakers is now open at sharepointeurope.com, where you will also find details of our 30% discount offer. Check out sharepointeurope.com for full details. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Tom Morgan. Hello, Tom.
Hi there. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining today. It's fantastic to see you all here. I'm going to turn on my webcam in a minute as well, just so you can see me. It feels like it's a bit more engaged and personal. These webinars can often be a bit hard to kind of get over some of the enthusiasm and stuff. So I'm going to go over the top with the enthusiasm in the hope that by the time it kind of filters down to you, you'll still get most of it. All right, so let's start at the beginning then. Why are you here? Not as in you're not welcome. Of course you're welcome. It's brilliant to see you here. What I mean is, why are you here listening to this? So we're going to be talking about building apps, but maybe you're not a developer. Or maybe you've done some in the past, but you haven't done them with Microsoft Teams. So why are you here? Well, maybe it's because you've picked up on some of the buzz being generated around Microsoft Teams apps recently. And you thought, I want some of that. And that's a smart move because we're going to be talking about building out, the future of communication today. So pretty broad, pretty lofty goals there. So buckle up. We're going to be talking about the future, and that's really important. I think it's really important to be talking about the future. If you don't talk about the future, you end up being consigned to the past, and everything around us is evolving. The technology is constantly changing. It's that changing technology that makes things interesting. It makes things exciting. It's why we're all in tech. But like sharks, we need to keep moving. We need to keep evolving. So first of all, let's shoot down some assumptions. It's not hard to build applications in Teams. We're going to build a couple of things in this session. We're going to build a bot, but we're going to cover a load more than just that. And I'm going to talk through some of that because actually building bots is kind of easy in Teams now. In fact, let's start there. Let's start with an example of how easy it is. So here's an example of how easy it is to build something in Teams today. So last year we had a work experience student join us where I work for 3 days. Her name is Holly. At the time she was 15 years old. And in 2.5 days, she'd built this. This is a Spotify bot. Holly built it so we could control the Spotify instance we have in our office that everyone listens to kind of music. You can talk to it, you can ask it what's playing, you can search for different songs. Holly built this 2.5 days, 15 years old. This is kind of amazing, right? This is what the future is, being able to do things like this. This is why it's so important to get your head around this stuff, to understand how it all ties together, even if you're not naturally what you might call a developer, because you don't need to be anymore, but this stuff is coming and the evolution, your evolution has never been so important. So you need to be asking yourself, what's next? What's next for the world? What's next for technology? What's next for communication? What's next for me? What's next is really important. If you don't work out what's next, somebody else will, and they'll overtake you. Think about the world that we're in. Everything at the moment is reducing down to data. Things like cloud storage, cloud processing have completely changed how we do business and how we deal with data, and they've allowed us to work, with massive amounts of data in real time. Just pick some workloads like insurance, completely reducing to data. Driving is the most obvious, most visible example of how that whole kind of industry is reducing down to data. But even things like medicine, legal, just reducing down to data. Companies that harness that data, that can harness the right data at the right time and use technologies like AI, unfair advantage over the competition. Have a look at this quote. If you corner the market in data, you have probably more wealth advantages than if you corner the market in gold or oil. Data is the real place where the money's at. So this was said in 2018. And if I asked you, who said this, you might think, I don't know, Bill Gates, maybe Mark Zuckerberg. Actually, Justin Welby, he's the Archbishop of Canterbury in the UK. So he's not a natural techie. If you think what I'm talking about is way out in the future, you need to think again. With respect to him, if the Archbishop of Canterbury is talking about this stuff, it's very real and it's here. So why do you care about that? Well, like oil, data is not valuable by itself. It needs to be processed, it needs to be consumed. People need ways to communicate with their data. And how we communicate with our data is evolving, and it's going to be one of the most disruptive changes in our industry. So that's the thing that's happening. Here's another thing that's happening. So Microsoft Teams. You may know this already. They announced it last year. It's the fastest growing business application in Microsoft history. So pick any one of those stats, whichever one resonates with you more, whether it's the 30 million daily active users, whether it's 91% of the Fortune 100 companies, whether it's over 200 organizations with 10,000 seats or more. So whatever stat you choose, users are moving to Teams. And that kind of makes sense. It's a great place to do that collaborative work, to work together to get stuff done. It's how humans like working. So that all makes sense. And we're seeing it borne out now by the figures. We're seeing people move more and more, moving their workloads to Teams. So what do we know? We know that data is really important, and we know that how we communicate with that data is going to change how we work. And we know that more and more users are using Teams. So it's obvious what we have to do, right? We just have to kind of hit them in the middle. So is that obvious though? What does that actually mean, apart from being a nice diagram I can throw up on the screen? What are you supposed to do about that? Okay, let's take a real world example of how disruptive this change can be, because you might be listening to this and thinking, this is great, I don't really believe you, or prove it more. So this is a bit of a cautionary tale, actually. This is a good example of what's next in real world example that everybody can relate to. And so this is a cautionary tale because this could be how you get overtaken. Let's think about a use case we're all familiar with, finding out the weather. This is a very British thing to want to do. So this is how you found out the weather in the 1990s. You'd go to Yahoo and you'd search for weather, and you might search for weather Birmingham. And you'd get a lot of pages about the weather, you get a lot of pages about Birmingham, and if you were lucky, you'd land on this page, which told you actually what the weather was going to be like in Birmingham. Think of this like a hunter-gatherer. You were going out to the web, searching for the information you wanted every single time. Every day you'd go out and you'd hunt for the piece of information and you'd take it back home again, hunter-gatherer mode. Let's fast forward 10 years to the 2000s. And how did we get the weather in the 2000s? We used apps. Apps were the big change, the big thing that changed in that 10 years in how we consumed information, because apps give us a much better experience. Because this app already knows that I want the weather and that I want it in Birmingham. I don't need to tell it each time. I can go to the app, there it is. The app has gone already to find the information for me, and it has it waiting for me as soon as I'm there. So I've evolved. I'm not hunter-gatherer anymore. But now I have all these apps that I have to look after. So I've become a shepherd. I've become a shepherd of apps. This is my flock of apps on my phone. I have to keep them all there. I have to curate them. I have to keep them all up to date, keep them all happy. So I've changed. My information is easier to get to, but I still have a lot of work to do. And I've moved to this kind of shepherd model. So let's move into the 2010s. And now as we move into the 2020s, what do we do today? How do we get the weather today? We talk to things. Do I need an umbrella? Alexa, dress me. I'm too lazy to think. So these are, I've just set off the Alexa behind me. I thought that was going to happen. I meant to do something about it before this started, but I think I got away with it. These are bots. These are like natural extensions. We don't even have to think about what app we're interacting with. We just say what we want and it happens. The bot ecosystem figures this out. By no means is this perfect today. Absolutely, it is still evolving, but this is very much our future. Right now, a lot of the interactions we have with bots are typing rather than voice. That will change really quickly though. Soon we'll just be talking to the walls. So how has this changed how we access this information? Well, we've gone from hunting and gathering, we've gone through shepherding. This is kind of the McDonald's drive-through of data collection. It's exactly what I want, it's when I ask for it, without me actually having to do any work. This is kind of how everything is changing. And that's the landscape. Weather is a kind of an early adopter, if you like, of the things that are possible and where this is going. I massively see this coming to many workloads in the workplace. I think it's only a matter of time. And I think that's the landscape we're operating in. And that's why this stuff is so important. Data is king. Whoever can process and present that data the best will be the kingmaker. Bots are here, apps are here, they're staying. And we can't get away with just trivially like doing the bare minimum, because people like Holly, who you saw earlier with that Spotify bot, they're on our tails. Like they're going to innovate this stuff. They're going to come up with some really cool, interesting ways of accessing data. All right, so I know what you're thinking now. You're thinking this is great, but I'm here because I'm not a developer and I don't know how to do this stuff. Like, what am I supposed to do? Okay, I'm here to tell you that you don't need to be a hardcore developer to make use of a lot of this stuff. If you do any PowerShell, you'll 100% be absolutely fine. If you've ever written some Excel formulae, you can do this stuff, okay? And I'm going to show you that today. Kind of in a way, actually, development is not as hard as it used to be. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. But also, the landscape is moving so fast, actually, quite a lot of developers are making it up as they go along anyway. Don't tell them I said that. All right, I'm going to show you an example of something that is easier than you think it should be. Have you heard about Teams app templates? If you haven't, you should absolutely go and look at them. These are a collection of fully working apps. They've been written by Microsoft and the community. They solve specific problems. There's a list of them on the right-hand side. They're being added all the time. They solve very real business, like they're not just samples, they solve very real kind of business problems at the moment. They're open source, they're free. They come with really good documentation. They come with really good architecture diagrams. They're proper products, and you can use them in a couple of different ways. If you don't care at all about how they're written and you just want to use them for their functionality, you can absolutely do that. You can download them into your Azure tenant, get running with them today. You don't need to know a thing about how they work. That's one option. The second option is that you can take them and because they're open source, you can kick the tires on them, figure out what they do, and then start to look through the code and try and figure out how it works, how it hangs together, how you might change it, extend it, customize it. And the third way you might use them is if you are already a developer, they're a good kind of exemplars. They're good best practice for how like apps at scale are put together, how they're architected. So if we just take one at random, the list search one, it's what it does is it surfaces information in SharePoint lists. So if you've got information locked up in SharePoint lists, you can expose that information inside Microsoft Teams using what's called a messaging extension. I'm going to show you another example of a messaging extension in a minute. So this takes less than an hour to set up and have running in your Microsoft Teams, in your Azure, talking to your SharePoint. So you could roll this out to users this afternoon. Really exciting, really interesting. I put the links to the GitHub repo there as well, and there's a walkthrough video I did as well of exactly what it takes to set it up. If you want to kind of follow someone down the same path, kind of doing the same thing. This is what it looks like when you go and click on that GitHub link. It looks a bit codey, it looks a bit developer-y, but don't worry about it. All the code is here, but also there's a lot of English and there's a lot of explanatory information about what's happening. You can see 3 links here to the documentation, the deployment guide, and the architecture. Look down the links, you've got things like cost estimates as well. You've got a nice solution overview. You've got a deployment guide that is easy to follow. It lists out all the things you need. It doesn't make any assumptions, and it walks you through with screenshots as well for things that you can go through and just follow along and get deployed. So it's really accessible. And then if you need to know like the architecture, if you need to get it signed off from anyone in your organization or anything like that, there's a nice architecture diagram as well. So it's not just the code, it's actually the whole package. It's really nice. So Teams app templates, I would definitely go and take a look at if you haven't done already. That's kind of one example of how you can dip your toe in without needing to be an actual developer or even actually write anything. So let's wind back a bit. Let's assume that you do want to write something. You've never built an application before, but you've got an idea for something you think would be, a thing that might be quite good to go as a Microsoft Teams application. So where do you even start with that? What process should you go through? Okay, first rule, you have to have a plan. You need to know what it is you want to build. I'll quickly tell you a story about my A-level computing teacher. So A-level is around ages 16 to 18. My computing teacher at the time, and there's a couple of reasons I remember him. One of which was he had this big sign printed in his computer laboratory, and it was printed on that dot matrix paper that's all joined together that you tear off the sides. And so it was it was probably kind of 10 sheets long, stuck on the wall, massive font. And he used to point up at it every now and again. It was his mantra, it was his thing, and it's always stuck with me. His sentence was this: typing is no substitute for thinking. Because it's really easy to jump into writing code straight away and just start there. But actually, it's worth zooming out a bit, because your Teams application that you're going to write, it's an interaction with the user. And if you're writing a bot, which is kind of the popular application, everybody wants to write bots, that is the only user interface is the conversation you're having with bot. There is no other interface. So if you don't get the interaction right, people won't use it. Users have choices for what they're doing. Users have never had so many choices. So you need to be good. There's 3 things to consider. And I'm going to go through each of these. This is kind of a good checklist to run through before you start getting your hands dirty. So first of all, viability. Basically, can you build what it is you want to build? Is it even possible given the constraints, given the technology, given what's available? Because this landscape keeps changing. So what is a no today is worth revisiting in a couple of months' time to see if it's become a yes. So there are a few different ways that you can build Teams applications. And you may be familiar with these already. It depends how much you've kind of used Teams, but you've probably seen most of these. You've seen tabs. They're inside channels or in kind of one-to-one conversations, and they're really good for surfacing information, showing large amounts of information to a user. Bots, everybody wants to build bots. We're going to come back to bots in a minute. Messaging extensions I'm going to do a quick demo of because I don't think they're used enough and I think they're amazing. Connectors are a way of bringing third-party information into Teams from other sources and bringing it into Teams as messages. And then it's worth knowing as well that you can change the activity feed. You can put things into the Teams activity feed as well. This landscape of what's available is constantly changing. So the best thing you can do is to stay up to date. And this is a really good landing place. This Teams developer kind of landing hub is a really good place for kind of all the documentation. There's loads and loads of samples in here. There's lots of demo code. It's not just C#. There's Node.js stuff in there as well, if that's your flavor of choice. There's lots of different options there. But I did want to show you a quick demo of messaging extensions as well, because I think it's worthwhile. So I'm going to flip quickly over into Microsoft Teams. What do I mean by these messaging extensions? Well, they're the things down here at the bottom underneath the compose bar where you might go to add some images or add some emoji or attach a file. You can put your own stuff in here. Why would I want to do that? Okay, well, let's come up with an example. Let's say the company I work for has a large product database, and we talk about products between ourselves all day long. And we use these codes to refer to products because, you know, that's what everybody does, right? But if I'm new into this organization, there's a whole conversation going on about product 4547, and I have no idea what product 4547 is. So I have to go off to the product database and look it up just to get some frame of reference, just to get context for the conversation that's taking place. And that seems silly. Why not take all the information from the product database, bring it into Teams, which is where people are having their conversations? And that's where messaging extensions can really help. So let's pretend this is our product database, and I can quickly search for product code in here. And this is just kind of fake data. So all the product photos are pictures of cats, and all the names are all made up. But this might be a particular product I care about. I don't know, let's choose this one. And this might be the product. And I can see quickly, I get a nice picture, I get the image, whatever description, the amount in stock. I can click and it renders a nice card. I can now have a conversation with my peers in Teams about this particular thing without everybody needing to go back to the product database to figure out what product it is I'm talking about each time. That's a really kind of simple example of how messaging extensions can be really good at bringing information in from line of business applications. I want to show you because I don't think they're used enough, and I think they're really powerful. So, usability. This is important. It's way more important than most people give it credit for, because if your thing is bad to use, guess what? People aren't going to use it. So you have to make it easy. You have to make it fun and enjoyable. If you do all that, people will forgive you a lot. So think about the journey that you're taking your users on, and don't let users get stuck, especially on bots, by the way, because they don't have a real user interface, the conversation is the only interface. So you have to be really careful that you don't let your users get stuck. Here are some kind of golden rules. Teams is a collaboration application, so it's why users love it. People like talking to people, so make your app about collaboration. Make it about sharing information. Make it easy to involve other people. Make it personalizable, so make it so people can change it and make it their own, and really make it feel like it's working for them. And then don't make an application that drives a user into a hole. What do I mean by that? It means like they can't get out, they can't share the information they've discovered, they can't involve other people. So don't be that application that locks away all the information and only shows it to one person at a time. Encourage sharing. So don't be an app hole is the key message to take away. You might think that you can't do this, but absolutely this is worth doing. Talk to your users about the app you're going to write. Don't assume that you know everything about what they're going to do or how they're going to use it. You don't need to have fully created your application before you go to your users. users get things like bots. You can have that level of conversation about what would you ask for, what would you need to provide, what would you have the bot do. Go and talk to your users, write it out on a board. You don't need to be a fancy designer, you don't need to do fancy wireframing if you don't want to. You can just write it down on a piece of paper. Figure out who your users are and the things they're trying to do before you start writing code. This is super, super important, because otherwise you're going to write something and people aren't going to use it. And yes, maybe you can evolve it over time, but actually you get one chance to make a good impression, that first impression. So make it count. So make sure that, when you're building your app, don't try and shoot for the moon. Do one thing, do it well. Focus on delivering value all of the time, and just kind of concentrate on delivering things that users are telling you are really important. Okay, so it's worth knowing as well that you can send more than just text. So some scenarios call for it. It's not all about just sending text. You can put things like cards into Microsoft Teams. This is a common abstraction called cards, adaptive cards. It allows you to attach images, videos, buttons, different layout types. There's a really good card editor in App Studio as well that you can use to help you. And this is kind of changing. This is a good example actually of how things are changing all of the time. So breaking news, as of a few days ago, the rendering engine that Teams uses for adaptive cards has just been updated. So if you're familiar with what adaptive cards are, then I can tell you that Microsoft Teams now supports adaptive cards 1.2, which just unlocks a bunch more functionality basically. If you're not familiar with any of that, don't worry, just know that this stuff is constantly being improved over time. And the final thing to think about here around kind of tooling and libraries, and really what do I mean when I say that? I mean stealing stuff and reusing it, because everything is built on something else. Scott Hanselman had this really good quote where he said he was abstracting on the shoulders of giants, which is kind of so true. Everything is built on something else, and you don't need to start from scratch and kind of reinvent the wheel all the way from like the beginning. You can totally take some of these things. So for instance, the Teams app templates I just showed you, you can totally take and you can start with and just build on it. There's a whole community called the Bot Builder community. If you want to build a bot, go and have a look at that stuff, because they're building new and interesting things out all of the time. And then that virtual assistant solution builder at the bottom is if you're building like a massive thing for an enterprise, that's a good place to go, because that's a full like end-to-end enterprise ready bot that's there. I'm going to talk through some of these in a bit more detail as well. Okay, so other tools that you should be aware of, just to kind of set the scene before we dig in. The Azure bot service is also called BotFramework. Sort of this, for the purposes of this, let's assume it's kind of the same thing. This is like a really big part of building bots in Teams, and it's a whole abstraction. The idea is you write your code against the bot framework, and it then works in lots of different places, of which Teams is just one of them. Now, if you're only writing for Teams, you kind of don't care about that, but the potential is there for you to write a bot that works on Teams, but also just as well works against Skype for Business, works against Slack, works against Twilio, so you can do it by SMS, works in Quick, works in by email even. So there's loads of different options there that you have. So that's what it is. You find it inside Azure. It's where it's called the Azure Bot Service, and it lives kind of in the cloud in Azure. The other big thing you should be aware of, and again, both of these are kind of entire talks by themselves. I'm letting you know they exist, so you can kind of dig into them later if you need to. And that's Lewis, the language understanding service. This is how you add natural language to your apps. It's how, when you talk to a bot and you think, wow, that bot just got what I just said, how on earth did it do that? Or conversely, you often see it the other way around, where you don't have any of this stuff in, and it's a real hassle to talk to a bot because you have to say exactly the right thing. This abstracts away all the hard work of this natural language stuff, and it means you don't really have to understand it. You just need to set it up and benefit from it. It's a nice system that you set up in Azure, and then you get a nice API you can call from your app, or you can call it from PowerShell or any other workload. Actually, it's not specific to bots. It's just a nice way of adding natural language to the things that you do. And then this is a bit dev heavy, so if you're not an out-and-out developer, you can safely ignore this slide. Just know that it exists, because you might end up needing it one day. And that's ngrok, which, the way BotFramework works and the way Teams works, they all need publicly accessible HTTP sites. So when you publish your bot to the BotFramework, you publish it in a way that is publicly accessible so that the BotFramework can access it, because it all just lives in the cloud. It's all secured with keys and everything, but just so you know, you can't run it completely locally, for instance. Now, that's a problem if you're doing kind of developing and you're still writing it, because you kind of want it to be running locally, because you want to do all the debug stuff and all the rest of it. So that's a bit of a pain. This gets around that. Essentially, it will give you a public-facing HTTPS endpoint to a local site, and that can be a local HTTP site as well. So ngrok.io, it's free to start. There are paid plans if you need it, but the free one's pretty good. So it's just worth knowing that that exists, because you might well need it. And then, kind of obviously, Azure is, the place where all the stuff lives, but it's worth exploring to see, if you're using the right thing. Don't just kind of assume that you need a database, therefore it has to be SQL. There are other resources, things like storage queues and storage tables are way cheaper and can save you a ton of money. One piece of advice I've picked up is to kind of pinch pennies wherever you can and save as much money when you're setting up your Azure resources, because you don't know ahead of time how your application is going to do. It might become the next massive thing, and you might be looking at thousands of users, people using it every day. That's a bad time to find out that actually every user interaction is quite expensive to you. So if you can penny pinch, if you can use things like functions and serverless technology, which is much more favorably priced, then that's worth doing. I recently found this with an app I wrote called RememberThis, which is based on scheduling. So you can add it to a Microsoft Teams conversation. You can say, remember this in 3 days' time, so that as stuff scrolls off the conversation list in Teams, you don't forget about it, because in 3 days' time, it puts a message back to bring it back into focus to say, hey, I'm reminding you about this conversation you didn't want to forget about. My first implementation of that involved a database, because I wanted to store all these timestamps that people needed to be reminded on, which makes sense. But actually, that's quite expensive, running a database, running some scheduling engine to constantly check whether some schedulers come up. I looked around. It turns out I could use storage queues. And what's interesting with storage queues is that with Azure storage queues, you can have code execute as soon as something goes into a storage queue. So completely serverless Azure function, which you pay basically nothing for, because you only get charged whilst the code is running. You can have that kick off as soon as it goes into a storage queue. On top of that, you can actually schedule when stuff goes into a storage queue, and you don't have to write any of that. So that's exactly what I do. I put stuff into the storage queue with a future start date, so it doesn't actually pop up in the queue until the time the reminder needs to happen. And then I have some serverless code, look at the thing that's in the queue, and immediately send the notification to the user. So I get scheduling basically for free. It's done for me by Azure. I don't even have to pay for it. Things like that are worth investigating and worth taking the time to kind of figure out if you can do. All right, fine. So we've got to this point, and I know what you're thinking. This guy can talk, and he keeps telling me that development is easy, but talk is cheap. So show me a demo. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to build a weather bot. I'm going to build a bot because we like the weather. I'm going to build a bot to tell me what the weather is in different places. But I want to tell you this quick story because it's really instructive to have the things I'm trying to tell you, and the message I'm trying to get across is to just look at this evolution of this demo. I've done this demo for 4 years now, this building of a weather bot on Microsoft Teams. When I started in 2017, It was a full-on 60-minute session just on building a weather bot. It was terrifying because it was just me writing code up at the front. It was probably pretty boring as well for everybody watching. I had to bring my own keyboard. I did that much typing. There's a photo of me having just given one of that presentation at Evolve with my keyboard. So that was 2017, and it took 60 minutes. 2018, 2019, that same session, I still did it, but it only took 30 minutes. Why? Because the Azure bot service had kind of become a thing. It wasn't a thing before. In 2017, it didn't exist. 2018, it became a thing, and it was then suddenly much easier to get started with templates and modify them. So it still involved writing code, but a lot less code. And so that was good, but I still got feedback from people saying, there's still code in here. You're still making me act like a developer, and you told me I didn't have to be a developer. Why are you making me write code? Which is fair. So 2020, I think I can do this with no code now, and I think I can do it in 20 minutes, which is good because that's how long we've got left. And I think I can do it without writing any code, and I think I can make it more interesting to watch. Now, disclaimer, you lucky people are the first people I've tried this on live. So I've not tried this before in a live session. So we will see how well it goes. Now, this is going to require me to do something different than I've done before. And that is involving what's called the BotFramework Composer. I'm going to talk about this in a minute afterwards. It's a brand new thing. It's super, super new. It's still in preview. It came out at Ignite, and it wasn't massively talked about, but this is amazing. This lets you build bots without needing to write any code. Let's try. So we know we're going to build a weather bot. It's going to ask people what the weather is, and then it's going to give them the weather. So what do we need to do in order to do that? We need to ask them, we need to find out they want the weather first of all. So they're going to come to the bot and ask for the weather. Then we need to ask them where they want the weather for, so what location. And then we need to go and look up the actual weather. We're going to use an API to look up the weather. Here's Postman. If you're familiar with it, then great. If you're not, it's just a thing for sending and receiving HTTP requests. So I've got a nice long HTTP string here that will get me the weather in London because I've got the location London here, and it's going to return it in metric because I'm UK, and it's going to give me the weather here, overcast clouds, and some temperature. So that's a good start. So I've got an API I can use. So how do I use this BotFramework Composer? Well, let's go new. Let's go create from scratch. Let's call it Tom's weather. So this is absolutely a thing you can do today. I'll talk in a second about how you can get hold of this. So it's made a entry point here called greeting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to send a response back to the user and say, hi, I do weather. Type weather to get started. So I've given the user something they can do. Type weather to get started. Now, what does that mean, type weather to get started? Well, if I come back up here, this bot needs to understand what users are saying. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. Lewis is the language understanding intelligence service, that natural language processing I spoke about, fully supported here. In the interest of time, I'm actually not going to use it. I'm just going to use a regular expression. So that old kind of keyword style that I said was really bad. Yep, I'm going to use that here. So what I'm saying is, if the user says weather, then we know they want the weather. And that's pretty boring, but it's good for now. Okay, so I've got my greeting where I'm telling my users to sort of type weather to get started. So what we need when they do type weather, we need a trigger based on that. So let's say new trigger. This type of trigger is recognizing a specific intent of type weather, which is the one I created. There are some other different things you can respond to, different activities and different dialogues. I'm going straight in with this intent of weather. So let's submit that one. So what happens then? This is the intent of, like, I could do all the code in here for doing all the weather. What I'm actually going to do is do a new dialogue. It's just a nicer way of splitting up code into different chunks. So I'm going to do this new dialogue, and let's create a new dialogue. Let's call it get weather, if I could type correctly. Let's do that. So that takes me to the nice new begin dialog of get weather. Right, so what do I need to do now? I need to ask the user where they want the weather for. So let's ask a question with some text. Look at all these different choices I've got: date and time, multiple choice, number input. I'm just going to choose this one for text, and I'm going to say, where do you want the weather for? So I'm skipping out loads of functionality that's in here. I could add different lines in here, and it would randomly choose between them to make my bot feel a little bit more less scripted. I'm going to tick always prompt so that we can come back to this and run it again and again and again, and it will kind of ask each time. Let's have a look. The other thing I'm going to do is, let's have a look. I'm going to put the results of this in, here we go. So the property to fill. So when the user fills in where they want the weather for, I'm going to say user.location. So this is just a field that is going to get filled with that location. And then let's send back another response that says, getting you the weather in user.location. See, I'm using those curly brackets to kind of put that parameter back in. Okay, so we haven't really done anything except found out where the user wants the weather for and then told them we're going to go and get it. But we can click Start Bot at the top, do some reloading, and it'll think about it, and I can click Test in Emulator. The emulator is a local emulator I can use to test my code locally, which is super useful. Allows you to kind of quickly iterate on different things, kind of start and just sort of keep going with it, try different things out and all the rest of it, which he says, but it might not actually work, which is going to be fun. We'll let it carry on and see if it kind of wants to come back in a minute. I'll just sort of refresh this and see if I can't get it to work. So where are we at? Let's let this load. And we've got a nice begin dialog. Oh, come on, right, yep. Click Start Bot again. Test emulator, no, okay, fine. Well, we'll carry on anyway, even though we can't get it to work just yet. What this should do really is open a link in a new page, which then triggers off to the BotFramework emulator, which is the way that we can test this stuff locally. I've got a good way of showing it once it's deployed as well, so I'm not super worried. We're going to carry on anyway, and then we'll show you it kind of as it looks at the end. So having got the weather, the next thing we need to do is call this API. And that's actually not as hard as you think it's going to be either, because one of the things we can do down here is access an external resource, such as sending an HTTP request. So what does that do? So what I need to do is make this call here to this API, but instead of here where it's got Q equals London, I'm going to replace that with my one. So I'm going to make a GET request, and it's going to be to this URL here, and let's put the HTTPS on the front. And where it says Q equals London, I'm just going to replace that with user.location, just like that. And then I'm going to put the result property in. So the result property is the thing that comes back from the API call. So it's this massive blob of JSON. So I'm going to put that into another property just so we don't lose it. Okay, so that makes the API call. Now that may work, it may not. So what we should do really is put an if statement in to make sure. So there's an if else. I'm trying to just choose interesting things so you can see how powerful this really is to use. So I can do a check here to say, well, actually take that weather data, take the status code, and if it's 200, then great. If it's not 200, let's just send a message back to the user to say, oops, something happened. But if it is, then what we could do is, let's just set a property. What we'll do is set a new property. all I'm going to do is make a new property and call it weather. And I'm just going to pull out the actual content of that HTTP call just to save me typing it again that each time, because it's kind of tedious to type that each time. And now we have a thing called dialog.weather, which is actually the weather, which means that we can send the response back to the user of something like, and I'm just going to save you watching me type. Let's just go through this. So right now in location, it's dialog.weather.main.temp, which is the temperature, degrees, with, and then the type of weather. And that is how we can build up a bot that just kind of calls out to an API and surfaces it back again. So that's how the whole thing ties together. This button is still not, oh, it is going to work. Random. Okay, fine, great. That's good. So what this should do, and I'm keeping everything crossed, is open the local emulator, meaning that we can actually see it working. No. Okay, so hi, I do weather, type weather to get started. So that's the thing I said right at the beginning. So if I was to type weather, where do you want the weather for? Okay, let's go with London to start, nice easy option. Getting you the weather in London. Right now in London, it's 9.28 degrees with overcast clouds. Right, so you might think that's a bit made up. So let's make some changes so you don't think I'm just kind of pulling the wool completely over your eyes. So let's change this to here's your location, weather. Okay. Because I didn't get the chance to kind of run the bot halfway through so you can see it being built, this is kind of a good way to make sure that you don't think I'm just making it up. And we'll choose a different city as well. So wait for the emulator to come back again. Right, I do weather, that weather to get started. Let's do weather. Let's do New York. Here's your New York weather. Right now in New York, it's 0.5 degrees with clear skies. So in actually a little under 20 minutes, I would say that's probably more like 10 minutes, we've created a weather bot and we didn't have to write any code. So this is amazing. How do we go from this to running in Microsoft Teams? Okay, so this is in preview. This whole thing is in preview, so this is going to get better, but let me just show you it now. Publishing. There's some buttons here that help you push this stuff into Azure and set everything up for you. You don't need to know how any of it works. Basically, you fill in some stuff here, and there we go, like so, and then it gives you a script to run. It says go and run this in your terminal and all will be good. That takes ages to run. It takes a long time to run, and I'm not going to do it now because it's not much fun to watch. But what that will do is create all the Azure resources you need and deploy it out to Azure for you every time you change it. I did this yesterday. I did this with another bot yesterday, very, very similar, also a weather bot that I was kind of doing just to make sure it worked for this session. So I can quickly show you what that looks like as well. So give me 2 seconds, because I'll do that right now. So this is what it creates when you run that script and it pushes into Azure. It creates all these bits for you, including a bot channel registration, which if you've never seen before, you don't need to know anything about. If you've done anything with bots, you'll be familiar with the bot channel registration. It's a nice way of, it's the registration that Azure needs to kind of register your bot. There's a nice testing web chat function here as well. Very similar to the local one, except you're running the actual code and you're doing it straight in the published code on Azure. So you can see actually it's a very similar bot. It's the one I wrote yesterday with a slight bug in it that it always remembers. It only asks you once and doesn't prompt you again. So it's only ever kind of stuck with getting the weather in New York at the moment until I fix it. but you can kind of see it's the same bot. So you go through that process to deploy it. Getting it in teams, again, you don't need to do anything development-y wise. This is BotFramework. So if you remember me saying earlier, it's an abstraction on lots of different services. If you come down to channels in here, you can see all those different services that are supported down at the bottom. And one of them is Microsoft Teams, which is running. I haven't tried this yet, so this may or may not work, but in theory, you ought to be able to go straight to Microsoft Teams and use this same bot and talk to this bot for getting the weather. So we'll see. I should have tried this first because oh no, maybe yes. Let's do Manchester. Perfect. So now it's running in Teams. So that same bot that we wrote using the UI without actually writing any code, we've pushed through almost the same bot. If you can type the thing I did last night and waited for it to deploy, you can see it's the same thing. We pushed into Azure. From there, we've made it available in Teams. We haven't needed to write a single line of code to make that happen. All right. So what have we learned? Where are we at? Let's have a look. Yeah, so we were using BotFramework Composer. This is in preview. That's a bit of a warning. There are dragons. It was announced in 2019, but it allows you to build these bots using visual flows. The really interesting thing about this is that under the hood, it's creating regular BotFramework code. So if you're an organization and you've already got developers on staff, you can start here, make it the visual flows, take the project, throw it at your developers, have them tidy up, have them own it. Or you can go the other way. You can do a bit of both. You can mix and match. It's not making anything special other than regular BotFramework code. So you can start with the composer and move to the code later. A couple of warnings. So today, it requires a local build to get started. And if you notice when I was looking at the BotFramework Composer, I was running locally. So there's a bit of kind of setup. Publishing, as I've alluded to, is a little bit painful. Both of those problems are 100% going to get better. So this is still in preview, and that's why. Those problems will go away. They will get easier. But this is a really, really good place to start if you're building out bots, because you genuinely can write bots now without needing to write a single line of code. If you want to learn more about that, go to BotFramework Composer, because that's got all the stuff on it. It's that's where you can kind of go to just kind of get all the lowdown, get all the information about everything that's happening with it, and you'll get all the latest updates there as well. Okay, so lastly, just want to kind of quick thing about building apps and then what happens after you publish your app and people are using it and you get it out there. Because people find problems, they find bugs, they use your application, and which is a great thing, but then they find problems with it, and what can you do about it? Because suddenly you're responsible for these problems and responsible for looking after your application. And some people are better at doing this and looking after their application and pushing out updates than others. So I'm terrible at this, by the way, just for reference, because I'm very bad at like maintaining applications. I get bored and move on, but all the ones I do are free, so it's kind of a trade-off. In the old days, this was a real problem, because in the old days, we used to release software with CDs. So you'd burn a CD and then it was locked pretty much. Once it had gone to be burnt, that was it. You couldn't change it. If you found a bug 5 minutes later, you are done for. Like, you've got to wait 3 months for the next CD cycle. But now all this stuff just lives in the cloud. You could instantly update this. I could find a problem with that weather bot. I could change it on my local machine. I could republish it to Azure, and then everybody will be using it the next day. Your app is a SaaS model, which is amazing. And that's a huge opportunity for small teams, for single person developers, because you can fix and fail fast. You don't need a dedicated QA resource. If you have one, that's amazing, that's brilliant, that's, you know, they're really good. But if you don't have one, it's not a blocker anymore, because guess who's really good at testing like a real user? A real user. So you don't need it. People are really forgiving as well, like about finding bugs. If you can turn those bugs around really quickly, they will forgive you all sorts of stuff. So that's where we are. That's the landscape. This technology is evolving. Bots are replacing apps. Data is king. Users are moving on to Teams. If you haven't already built a Teams app for your organization, why not? What's stopping you? Look how easy it is. There's all these tools to help you. Take the app templates, take the BotFramework Composer, do whatever, pick whichever road you want. Do both, do neither, do something else. There's lots of different ways you can build applications now for Microsoft Teams, and that's where your users are going. Think of like the things that you can do for your users to kind of unlock some of their potential and make them work smarter as well. So I would say for me, if you want my takeaways, grow and evolve, step out of your comfort zone, try this stuff out. You might be really surprised at what happens. Thank you ever so much for listening. My name is Tom Morgan. I work at Modality Systems. We've got 5 minutes for questions. Sorry, it's a bit short, but you can always find me on Twitter afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks for a great presentation, Tom. Yes, we will now start the questions and answers part. And should you wish to ask Tom a question, type it into the questions window now. Here are some questions, Tom. First one in, I've heard of Power Virtual Agents mentioned as a way to build bots. Is this the same as what you showed or different?
Oh yes, so Power Virtual Agents, another visually visual first way of building bots, also announced by Microsoft, also announced at Ignite 2019. It's wonderful the way Microsoft do this. They are quite separate. The good thing about them though is that the code they produce underneath is the same. So they're all built down to the same bot framework code. So you can start with Power Virtual Agents if you've already started down that road, and then you can cut over, and the skills that they create, that's what the underneath the bot frameworks modules are called skills, are transferable between something you write in the bot framework composer and Power Virtual Agents. But they are different technologies, albeit solving the same problem.
Okay, great. What advice would you give for working on Teams development within constrained and regulated customers with heavily locked down tenants?
Yeah, this does come up quite a lot. The big thing, I think you've got to be open and honest upfront about pretty much everything in Teams needs to be publicly accessible over HTTPS. The challenge then, and I'd come up with that as like there's no way around that. However, that's Microsoft's solution, and Microsoft are confident they can see, the way they are securing applications with the keys, with the app IDs, with the permissive model, is the right way to do it. You can find documentation from Microsoft that tells you that's the only way to do it and that's the right way to do it. I would say if you can do that combined with showing what's possible, doing some proof of concepts with sample data, just to show how awesome a Q&A, just something like Q&A Maker is a great start. Showing how like liberating and amazing this technology can be goes a long way to kind of unlocking some of what's possible.
Okay, next question. How good is that natural language processing intent extraction from the Lewis framework? Does it have any contextual history?
Yeah, so it's really good in terms of taking sentiment from a particular sentence and pulling out the intent. In terms of history, some of that is on you. So if you want a smart bot that can reference the answer to a question you gave it 3 questions ago, and then use that, some of that's on you. There is more and more, it's evolving to become better and better in terms of building out some of that kind of contextual stuff. But a lot of that sort of state management, if you like, is a bit on you because it's so specific to the use case you're solving. But the actual, does Lewis do a good job of taking the sentence and figuring out what the intent was? It's as good as the model, but it can be amazing. So it's basically as good as the data you put in, which is a classic consulting answer. But it's true. The data you can give it, the better. But I think you'd be pretty surprised. Q&A Maker is a great place to start, by the way, if you just want to get an idea of how Lewis works. Q&A Maker, 0 code. You pointed a list of frequently asked questions, like a website or a document, you've got a PDF or just a list of questions and answers. It will generate a bot with a natural language model that you can then just test out with no training, no manual training. So it's the kind of basically the worst it could be without you putting any effort in at all, but it still does a really good job of actually figuring out like the intent of all of the questions.
Brilliant. Tom, we're out of time. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the ESPC community, thank you for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, everybody, that is all for today's webinar. Again, thank you to Tom Morgan. Just a quick reminder that if you're interested in taking part in ESPC 20 in Amsterdam this November, a call for speakers is now open, and we are currently running a 30% discount offer. Simply sign up at sharepointeurope.com. This is the end of today's webinar. Please join us for our next webinar tomorrow as part of Teams Week, and see details of all upcoming webinars or visit the Resource Center where all previous episodes are available. Thank you for joining us today. Take care and goodbye.